I've sat across from hundreds of patients over the years, men and women in their 50s, 60s, sometimes 70s, all telling me the same quiet sentence in different ways. I guess this is just what getting older feels like. And almost every time I would look at them, not their faces, but their patterns. Because by the time they came to me, their bodies weren't the mystery anymore. Their habits were. Morning would start the same way it had for decades. A bowl of cereal, something labeled heart healthy, a glass of orange juice poured from a carton that promised vitamins. It felt like a good start, responsible even. By noon, it was something quick. A sandwich, white bread, processed meat, a handful of fries on the side, maybe a soda, maybe diet if they were trying. And dinner. Dinner was the meal they felt they deserved. A full plate, meat at the center, potatoes, something warm, heavy, familiar, vegetables, sometimes there, sometimes not. Nothing about it felt extreme. That's what made it dangerous. Because when you look at a single day, it seems harmless, normal, almost careful. But I've learned not to look at one day. I look at 30 years. And what I see is not aging. It's accumulation. I can't tell you how many times I've heard it, almost like a quiet agreement people make with themselves. This is just what happens when you get older. They say it without anger, without resistance, just acceptance. And for a long time, I didn't interrupt that belief right away, because I understood where it came from. You wake up one day and your body feels heavier than it used to. Your energy dips a little earlier. Your waistline expands in ways you can't quite explain. Nothing dramatic, just a slow shift. So you assume it must be age. But after years of watching this pattern repeat itself, I started to notice something that didn't sit right with me. Age doesn't change that quickly. Habits do. The body doesn't suddenly decide at 55 or 60 to store more fat, to feel more tired, to crave more sugar. It responds, quietly, consistently, honestly, to what it's been given, every single day. What most people call aging, I often recognize as something else entirely. A body that has been dealing with the same signals, over and over again. Blood sugar rising and falling like a wave it never escapes. Inflammation building, not in one big moment, but in thousands of small ones. A digestive system that has been working harder than it should, for longer than it should. None of this feels urgent in a single day. That's why it goes unnoticed. But give it 10 years, 20, 30, and suddenly it looks like decline. Not because the body failed, but because it adapted to a pattern that never changed. And that's the part most people never get told. Your body isn't breaking down. It's following instructions. Over time, I realized something else. Most of my patients weren't eating recklessly. They were eating exactly the way they had been taught to. That's what makes this so difficult to see. Take breakfast, for example. A bowl of cereal doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels light, controlled, even healthy depending on what the box says. But what the body sees is something very different. It sees finely processed grains, broken down so quickly that they behave almost like sugar the moment they enter your system. Then the orange juice, which people often believe is one of the healthiest parts of their day. But without the fiber of the whole fruit, it becomes a fast delivery of sugar. Clean, yes, natural, maybe, but still rapid. And when that happens, your blood sugar rises quickly. Your body responds the only way it knows how. It releases insulin. Not once, but repeatedly day after day. And over time, that pattern begins to change how your body stores energy. Not in a dramatic way, in a consistent one. Lunch follows a similar story. White bread, soft, easy to eat, easy to digest. Processed meats, convenient, familiar. Fries, cooked in oils that the body doesn't quite recognize as fuel. Again, nothing feels extreme, but the body reads all of it. And dinner, often the heaviest meal of the day, becomes the final signal. Large portions, dense calories, not enough fiber to slow anything down. And then the cycle resets. The next morning, it starts again. There was a moment, years into my practice, when this became very clear to me. A patient once told me, "Doctor, I don't understand. I don't eat that much." And he was right. He didn't eat too much. He ate the same signals over and over again. That was enough. And that's when it changed for me, because I stopped asking how much people were eating and started asking what their body was hearing from it. At some point, I had to change the way I spoke to my patients, because telling someone to eat better never really works. It's too vague, too far removed from real life. And the truth is, most people don't need a completely different diet. They need a different understanding of the one they already have. So I stopped asking them to give things up. I stopped talking about strict plans or cutting everything they enjoy. Instead, I started showing them something much simpler: how to take the meals they already eat and change just enough so the body hears something different. Not less food, not less satisfaction, just different signals. This is where things begin to shift, not in a dramatic, overnight way, but in a way the body actually understands. And once that happens, it doesn't fight you anymore. It starts working with you. Breakfast was always the easiest place for me to start, not because it was the worst meal of the day, but because it was the one people trusted the most. There's something about breakfast that feels safe, predictable. You eat what you've always eaten, what you were told was good for your heart, good for your day, good for your energy. And for many of my patients, that meant a bowl of cereal, sometimes whole grain, sometimes low fat, sometimes something with fiber printed clearly on the front of the box. It felt like a responsible choice. But over time, I began to notice a pattern. The people who ate that kind of breakfast were often the same ones who felt hungry again, not long after, not starving, just unsettled, like something hadn't quite lasted. And when I looked closer, it made sense, because what looked like a light, controlled meal was often digested faster than the body could stabilize. The blood sugar would rise quickly, and then it would fall. Not in a way you could see on the outside, but in a way you could feel: a slight drop in energy, a quiet craving, a need for something else, even if you couldn't quite name it. And then there was the orange juice. Almost everyone I spoke to believed in it. It had been part of their mornings for decades. It felt clean, bright, healthy. But when you remove the fiber from fruit, you change the way the body receives it. What's left becomes fast, easy to absorb, easy to spike. So what many people thought was a gentle start to the day was actually a rapid signal, one that told the body to store rather than sustain. There's a moment I remember clearly, sitting across from a patient who told me, "I don't eat anything bad in the morning," and I believed him, because nothing he described sounded bad. That's when I understood something I hadn't fully seen before. The problem wasn't that people were making poor choices, it's that they were making choices based on a system that never explained how the body actually listens. So I stopped asking them to remove breakfast. I just asked them to change the conversation. Instead of starting the day with something that disappears quickly, start with something that stays, something the body can work with instead of react to. For some, that meant a bowl of oatmeal, not instant, but something with texture, something that takes time, with berries on top, a handful of seeds. Not because it's trendy, but because it slows things down. For others, it was simpler: eggs, a slice of whole grain bread, maybe some avocado, something warm, something steady. And for the first time, many of them noticed something they hadn't felt in years. Not a burst of energy, but the absence of the crash. And that was enough to tell me we were finally speaking the body's language. Lunch was never something people thought much about. It wasn't emotional like dinner. It wasn't symbolic like breakfast. It was functional, something to get through the day. And because of that, it became one of the most overlooked patterns I would see. Most people didn't sit down and plan lunch. They repeated it. The same sandwich, the same side, the same drink, day after day, for years. On the surface, it didn't seem excessive. A sandwich isn't a large meal. It's not indulgent. It doesn't feel like something that would slowly change your body. But again, I learned not to look at the size of the meal. I looked at what it was made of. White bread, soft, easy, almost effortless to chew. But in the body, it moves quickly, too quickly. It breaks down in a way that doesn't ask much from digestion, but demands a response from blood sugar. Then the filling. Processed meats, most of the time. Convenient, familiar, consistent, but heavily altered from what the body was designed to recognize. And then the side, fries or chips, Crisp, salty, satisfying in a way that doesn't last, cooked in oils that have been heated beyond what they were meant for, used again and again. And finally, the drink. Soda, or sometimes diet soda, as a compromise, something sweet, something cold, something that feels like a small reward in the middle of a busy day. Individually, none of these choices feel extreme. Together, they send a very clear message. And by mid-afternoon, the body answers, not with a warning, but with a feeling most people have learned to ignore. That quiet drop in energy, that need for another coffee, that subtle fog that makes everything feel just a little heavier than it should. For years, people told me that's just how afternoons are. But I've seen enough to know it doesn't have to be, because what feels like fatigue is often just a delayed response, the body trying to stabilize after being pushed too quickly, too many times. So again, I didn't ask people to give up lunch. I asked them to adjust it, just enough. The sandwich could stay, but the bread needed to change. Something with structure, something that slows down digestion instead of disappearing into it. The filling could stay, but it needed to come closer to something real. Grilled chicken, tuna, something the body could actually use, not just process. And the side didn't need to be removed, just replaced. Something with fiber. Something that doesn't rely on oil and salt to feel satisfying. And the drink. This was often the simplest shift. Not because it was easy, but because it was clear. When people removed the constant stream of sweetness, even artificial, something changed, not immediately, but noticeably. The afternoons became quieter, not in activity, but in the body. And for many of them, that was the first time they realized. They hadn't been tired, they had just been responding. Dinner was different, not because of what people ate, but because of what it meant. After a long day, dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a pause, a reward, something people felt they had earned. And over the years, I began to notice how deeply that belief shaped what ended up on the plate. Because when you believe you've earned your meal, you don't hold back, you don't measure, you don't question it. You serve what feels right. And for many of my patients, that meant a large plate, meat at the center, always steak, beef, something substantial, potatoes on the side, sometimes bread, something warm, filling, comforting, vegetables. If they were there, were often the smallest part of the meal, almost symbolic. And again, nothing about it looked extreme. It looked like dinner, the kind people had grown up with, the kind that made you feel full, and for a moment, satisfied. But the body doesn't interpret meals based on meaning. It responds to composition. And what I saw over and over again was this: the largest meal of the day, arriving at the time when the body needed the least, late in the evening, when movement slows down, when the system begins to shift toward rest. And yet, that's when it received the heaviest load. Dense calories, large portions, not enough fiber to slow the process, not enough balance to guide it. So the body did what it had to do. It stored, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. And then it repeated that process the next day, and the next. There's a sentence I've heard more times than I can count. I don't eat that much during the day. Dinner is my main meal. And again, they were telling the truth. But what they didn't see was how much that one meal was carrying, not just in calories, but in expectation. Because dinner had become the moment where everything came together: hunger, habit, emotion, relief. And once that pattern is set, it's hard to question it. So I never asked my patients to give up dinner. That would have meant taking away something much bigger than food. Instead, I asked them to look at the plate differently. Not smaller, just rebalanced. The meat didn't need to disappear. It just didn't need to take up half the plate. Vegetables, real ones, not as decoration, but as foundation. Something that slows the meal down. Something that changes how the body processes what comes next. And sometimes, just reducing the portions slightly, not enough to feel deprived, just enough to stop the excess. And when that shift happened, something else changed too. Not immediately, but over time. People stopped finishing dinner feeling heavy. They slept better. They woke up, not completely different, but slightly lighter. And for many of them, that was the first time they questioned something they had believed for years. That feeling full didn't always mean feeling better. The part most people overlook is never the main meal. It's what happens in between. Because no one really thinks of snacks as something that matters. They're small, casual, almost invisible. Something you reach for without thinking. A cookie with coffee, a handful of chips while standing in the kitchen, a soda in the afternoon, just to get through the rest of the day. Individually, they don't feel like decisions. They feel like moments. And that's exactly why they're so easy to miss. But the body doesn't separate them the way we do. It doesn't label something as just a snack. It registers everything. Every spike, every signal, every interruption. There's a sentence I've found myself repeating more often than I expected. You don't gain weight because of your meals. You gain weight because of everything you didn't think counted. And when people hear that, they pause, because they start to see it, not in theory, but in memory, the small things, the extra sweetness, the constant grazing that never quite allows the body to settle, especially with drinks, liquid sugar, or even artificial sweetness moves through the system quickly. It doesn't satisfy, it doesn't stay, it just tells the body to respond again and again and again. So the system never really rests. It just keeps adjusting, trying to keep up with signals that never stop. I didn't ask my patients to eliminate snacks completely. For some, that would have felt too abrupt, too restrictive. Instead, I asked them to make those moments more intentional. Something with structure. A handful of nuts. Yogurt. Something that actually feeds the body instead of distracting it. Fruit. Whole, not processed. And sometimes the most important change wasn't what they added, but what they removed. The constant sweetness, the automatic habit of reaching for something just because it was there. And when that quieted down, even slightly, the body noticed, not in a dramatic way, but in the space it finally had to stabilize. What surprised many of my patients wasn't how dramatic the changes were. It was how quiet they felt. No sudden transformation, no overnight results, just subtle shifts. The kind you almost miss if you're not paying attention. After a couple of weeks, some of them would come back and say the same thing in different ways. I don't feel as hungry in the morning, or I didn't reach for something sweet in the afternoon, and I didn't even notice. That was always the first sign. Not weight loss, not numbers, just less noise. The constant pull toward sugar, the small cravings that used to fill the gaps in the day, started to fade. Not completely, but enough to feel different. Sleep was another thing they mentioned. Not deeper in some dramatic way, just more settled. Less heaviness at night, less of that feeling where the body is still working, when it should be resting. And in the mornings, there was a slight change. Not energy like they were 30 again, just a little more ease, a little less resistance to starting the day. And then, over time, the physical changes began to follow. Slowly, the kind that doesn't shock you in the mirror, but shows up in how your clothes fit, how you move, how you feel sitting in your own body. And that's when I remind them of something simple. The body doesn't need perfection. It just needs consistency in the right direction. There's a moment that comes for many people, usually later than they expect, not when things are at their worst, but when they finally become clear. I've had patients sit in front of me, quieter than before, not frustrated, not confused, just reflective. And they say things like, I thought it was me. I thought I just didn't have the discipline. I thought something in my body had changed and there was nothing I could do about it. And I understand why they believed that. Because when something happens slowly, over years, it doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like identity. You start to believe that this is just who you are now. Someone who gets tired easily. Someone who gains weight no matter what they do. Someone who has to try harder, just to feel normal. But what I've seen over and over again is something much quieter than that. Most people weren't failing. They were following advice that sounded reasonable, following habits that felt normal, following a system that never really explained the cost. And when you follow something long enough, you stop questioning it. Even when your body starts to change, even when something doesn't feel right, You assume the problem must be you. That's the part that stays with me. Not the weight, not the lab results, but the belief, the quiet acceptance that this is just how it ends. And when that belief begins to shift, even slightly, something else shifts with it. Not just in the body, but in the way people see themselves. Because for the first time, they consider a different possibility, that they were never broken, just misinformed. By this point, most people expect something more complicated, a strict plan, a long list of things to avoid, but it rarely comes down to that. What I've seen is much simpler. The morning doesn't need to be removed, just slow down. The middle of the day doesn't need to be perfect, just more stable, and the evening doesn't need to feel restricted, just more balanced. Then there are the small things in between, the ones that never felt important, the ones that didn't seem to count. Sometimes, those are the ones that matter most. None of this requires starting over. None of it asks you to become someone else. It only asks you to look at what you're already doing and change just enough so your body can finally understand it. After all these years, this is the part I come back to most often. Not the data, not the numbers, just the quiet realization that most people were never given the full picture. They were told what to eat, but not how the body would respond. They were told what was healthy, but not what that word really meant over time. And somewhere along the way, they stopped questioning it. They trusted it, even when something didn't feel right. If there's one thing I've learned, sitting across from so many people, listening to the same story unfold in different ways, it's this. The body is not complicated, but it is consistent. It reflects what you do, far more than what you intend. And small things, the ones that seem harmless, the ones that feel routine, they add up, quietly, patiently, until one day you look back and call it aging. But it wasn't aging, it was direction. And direction can change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for the body to feel different, enough for you to feel like yourself again. Because in the end, you don't need to find the perfect diet. You just need to stop feeding your body the same misunderstanding every single day.